Tonight, I'm excited to welcome Daniel Squadron, celebrating the release of The Fourth Branch, How State Government Can Save Our Union. Daniel Squadron is a former aide to Senator Chuck Schumer, former New York State Senator, and the co-founder of the States Project. Squadron will be in conversation with E.J. Dionne Jr., a best-selling author, a syndicated columnist who appears twice weekly in the Washington Post and nearly 100 other newspapers. He's also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a professor at Georgetown University. His Why Americans Hate Politics won a Los Angeles Times Book Prize and was nominated for the National Book Award. He is a regular commentator on National Public Radio and on other radio and television programs. A VIP guest will be joining the conversation with Squadron and Dionne, Senator Chuck Schumer. The senator is the Senate Democratic leader and the highest elected Jewish official in American history. He is the author of Positively American, Winning Back the Middle Class, One Family at a Time, and most recently, Anti-Semitism in America, A Warning. So please, let's welcome them tonight.
Welcome, everybody. Hi. Welcome to some old friends here. Let me get up on this chair. First, I want to thank C-SPAN Book TV for being here. My late mom was a librarian, and it was her favorite show on television. So I was very excited when they came here, and I'm really happy to be here. The three of us have something very important in common, which is we all spent quite a lot of time in Albany, New York. I, as a reporter covering state government, Senator Schumer as a self-effacing state assemblyman from Brooklyn, and Senator Squadron as a state senator who took on, by the way, a 30-year incumbent and beat him in a primary. The thing we don't have in common is I am an ardent Boston Celtics fan. But I want to say that Dan
How's your spring been?
What?
How's your spring?
Yeah, we were great until those last three games. But Dan is so thoughtful that this event will end in time, so most people who care to do so can watch the game, including Dan. This is a very important book, and it's already gotten some really great reviews. Publishers Weekly called it an energizing call for engagement at state-level politics. It said a bunch of other nice things. Chris Hayes called it superbly persuasive. That's pretty good. I've always wanted that on a book. The book is full of interesting facts, which I'll get to, and also all these interesting categories you created that I like the whack-a-mole idea. But what I'm going to do first is just ask these two gentlemen to talk about the theory of the book. I'm going to begin Dan, with the obvious question, which is, for a lot of progressives, the notion of focusing on states seems out of step with a long tradition when states' rights was almost uniformly associated with people, southern states that resisted equality, voting rights, civil rights, and yet there has been a turn that your organization reflects. And I asked Dan before we came here, what was the best question he was asked the whole time? So this isn't mine. This is someone in an audience who said, look, isn't it better in most cases to have federal standards rather than state standards? And since he's been asked that question, he's had time, I'm sure, to figure out a really great answer to that question. For Senator Schumer, whom I've known for a long time, he spent...
We met at college, but we served in Albany. He covered a young assemblyman from Brooklyn when he was a young reporter for the New York Times.
So we go back a long way. And, basically, I couldn't resist asking, if state government is so important, why did you flee Albany and spend more than 40 years in the federal government? But also, relatedly, why are you here beyond the fact that Dan helped you write your book, Positively American, and I admire the loyalty to somebody who helped you write a book. But Dan, why don't you take the first? And eventually, Senator Schumer has to leave, just so you know, at about 7:30, so he's not storming out on his friend Dan or on you. But
Never.
Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you both so much for doing this. Been a longtime admirer, and Senator Schumer really has been my mentor and the cause of a lot of my opportunities in politics and actually in life, since his wife introduced me to my wife. So
My wife made the shidduch.
To your question, it really is true that the idea of states' rights or states having power is sort of very coded right wing. And that's true because of what you talked about relative to civil rights, going back to the Civil War, going back to the compromise that made the US Constitution. It also, after the New Deal, got coded right even more fully because it became the excuse to undo the state capacity that was federal, that developed under the New Deal and then the Great Society. And so Ronald Reagan, and I talk about this in the book, would bring a group of state lawmakers to the White House every single year. Talked about it, he waxed poetic. He said, "You're the ones who are making our federalism come true." By the way, I've asked every state lawmaker I know, no Democratic president does the same, the equivalent with state lawmakers on the other side. But it was just an argument for what they wanted to do. And there's nothing inevitable about state power that is about allowing racist laws or undoing the capacity of government. In fact, many great civil rights have started in states. I tell the story of how New York State passed marriage equality, and that was a catalytic event for marriage equality being taken up nationally. That New Deal I talked about was started by a great New Yorker, Frances Perkins, who was in FDR's gubernatorial cabinet before becoming the first female member of the United States cabinet. So actually, there's a real potential for states' choice as well. Actually, originally passed in New York State by a single vote, a single Republican who switched his vote, stood up, said, "I know this is going to end my career, but it's worth it."
Started it off.
I think that was 2 years before you got there, maybe.
Right, 72.
And if you look at the framers and you look at the Federalist Papers, actually states are about fighting authoritarianism. They're about decentralization of power. And in this moment, I don't think there's an idea that's more important for the practice of making true the idea that all people are created equal or that government secures rights through state capacity.
So, Senator,
Okay. Go ahead.
what are you doing here if all the action is in the
Right.
states?
Well, first, I do want to thank Daniel. He did write my book. He was also my body guy for 4 years, which meant everywhere I went, he went, which is the best way to learn about government. We visited every county every year. Inevitably, there would be state legislators, state assemblymen, state senators show up, and we'd spend time talking to them and learning what they were doing. He also wrote the first book I wrote called Positively American: How to Create the Middle Class. The good news about my book, Newt Gingrich said, of all people, that if Democrats follow Schumer's book, they will be the majority for a generation. The bad news is Democrats did not follow my book. No one bought it, and I have plenty of free copies in my basement.
You can write him if you want one.
I have plenty. But the story I want to tell, which relates to some of the hardened nature of the legislature, is I played a major role. Daniel didn't. I don't think we ever discussed this in making the state legislatures better. I got to the Assembly, New York State Assembly, in 1974. I was 23 years old. I worked for a big fancy law firm. I hated it. I loved politics. I ran for office on a lark. First day I ran, I went into my local barber. I said, "Frankie, would you put a poster in the window?" He said, "Sure, kid." And then he said, "Kid, I never told you this. I'm not only local barber, I'm the local bookie. You're the 50-1 underdog." But I won. And I got to the legislature, and I was amazed how ossified it was. It was controlled by the big party bosses. You had no staff, no money for a district office. In fact, it was so corrupt that most of the legislators were lawyers, and their state assembly office or their state senate office was in their law office. And when people walk in thinking they'd see a state assemblyman, they'd have some lawyer there try to sign them to a contract to do something. And so you may remember EJ, I don't think he was probably there when you were there. Another assemblyman and I, we had a huge number of Democrats come in. We had taken back the legislature in '74. It was the it was the water post-Watergate. And so we had like 30 freshman legislators and a guy named Mark Allen Siegel, who you may remember from the east side of Manhattan, and I organized the legislature. And we went into the speaker, who was the boss of Brooklyn, Meade Esposito. You know, it was Stanley Steingart. Meade was then the boss of Brooklyn. And we demanded that and the only staff you'd get before this was the assembly leadership would assign you a secretary for 3 months. And she was a spy. She was supposed to just tell the leadership anything that was going on in your office. So we had no staff and nothing back home. So we organized, the 30 of us, and said, we're not going to vote to move forward in the legislature unless we get staff and unless we get an office back in our district so we could serve our constituents. And for about 15, 20 days, the place was paralyzed. And then we won. And we got an amazing $10,000 for staff and $5,000 for what they then called OTPS, which was rent and all that other than personnel experience. And that started, California was more advanced. They had a staff, but almost no one else did. And that idea of having staff, now they have hundreds of thousands of dollars of staff in the Assembly and Senate, but that's what started the whole thing. So why did I leave? Well, it was a place controlled by the bosses, and you could get almost nothing done. If the boss of Brooklyn and Queens and Bronx got together, they'd want to vote for something, and that's what you had to do. The few of us who were sort of independents, I cut my eye teeth protesting the Vietnam War, and before I got to the Assembly, as EJ knows, because when I was president of the Harvard Democrats, EJ was the second vice president of the Harvard Democrats, right? Was that?
You outed me. To a whole national.
Wait, who was the first vice president of the Harvard Democrats?
You want to know who it was? Also someone famous, Cameron Kerry, brother of John Kerry.
Huh?
Yeah.
When he later became president, then we got to stop this. If you remember the John F. Kennedy line, at the time it wasn't great to be a Democrat. It was the campus was to the left of the Democrats, and he said a match has been passed to a new generation of young Democrats.
Harry Cates said that.
Yeah. But anyway.
So it was so ossified that, you wanted to make change, and obviously the Congress provided some real opportunity. I enjoyed the Assembly. I most really enjoyed the camaraderie with my fellow legislators. We had a great time. Daniel reminds me at 1 a.m, we sang Italian songs at Tony Seminario's restaurant. But you couldn't really get that much done. And I searched or thirsted to find a place where I could get more accomplished that wasn't controlled by the machine, because, say, in Brooklyn, there were maybe 3 or 4 independents and the rest of them just followed the machine.
It's interesting. I got to the legislature 35 years after you did, 34 years after you did. And I tell a story in the book, my first day there, the Brooklyn boss at the time, right? Nothing changes but the seasons in Albany, right? The Brooklyn boss at the time, Vito Lopez, came up to me. I had won against a 30-year incumbent Democratic primary with Senator Schumer's endorsement, and comes up to me and says, "Hey," never met him. "Hey," I say, "Hi, leader. Great to meet you. Here's my family. I'm so excited to be sworn in. I want to work with you." I wasn't looking to make enemies. And he says, "Come over here." He pulls me over to a staircase. He says, "I see you're here with your family. You're getting sworn in. Congratulations. Enjoy it. It'll be your last one." And that's how I was welcomed by the party machinery 34 years later.
But let me ask Chuck, take the question on the federal government and the states, because there is this, the States Project reflects, we could talk about the history that goes all the way back to a group called the Conference for Effective State Local Public Policy. People have tried this. I think it's not just Trump that has created the energy behind action at the state level. But maybe you could play a little bit of devil's advocate. How much can that work if the Supreme Court is going to make the kinds of decisions it makes if the federal government starts preempting progressive action at the state level, which it often tries to do?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's very hard when they try to come in and preempt. But I would say this, having told the story of the bosses, legislatures have improved dramatically. And now the fact that the machine no longer exists allows lots of younger, independent people to get into the legislature. And they, when you talk to them, are somewhat cognizant of this, and they look for ways to pass legislation that, the courts won't throw out or whatever. But it's obviously a barrier, like it's a barrier to us. But I'd say now more of the change, I always paid attention to the legislature because there were people who came up with good ideas. And you could you could work with them and use them and everything else. But I think that the idea that the courts will come in is not hanging over the head of the legislators as much. First, it's a long time away before any state law would get to the Supreme Court. Second, most of them don't get to the Supreme Court. And in fact, because of all the judges we put in 2 years ago, most of the times the executive branch does something. We win in the lower courts. We put in 235 judges who were not subject to Trump, and they could go to them. And this is an amazing thing, a little bit of the J-curve. 2/3 of those cases that are brought by people like Mark Elias and Skye Perryman and other people we work with never get appealed because the Justice Department has become so bad, because so much of the good people in the Justice Department have left and others have been kicked out because they won't follow, that a huge percentage of cases that are brought, that where they do an executive order in the lower court sides with us do not go up to even the Court of Appeals, let alone the Supreme Court.
Let me go to some of the stats in the book, which are interesting. 75% of the goals set out in the Paris Climate Agreement could be accomplished by state action. 90% of the country's law enforcement operates under state law. 87% of the inmates in our prisons are under states, and 85%, this one surprised me until I thought about huge state universities. 85% of university funding comes from the states. We have gone through, I mentioned earlier, cycles. In the progressive era in particular, which is when Louis Brandeis coined the laboratories of democracy, a lot of federal action originated that became the New Deal, either got enacted during the progressive era and even more so during the New Deal, originated in the states. Can you talk about how you see that happening again, and maybe some examples that you talk about in the book about where states have led to federal action as well?
Yeah, well, the most famous one, and we've actually talked about this in the past, is Obamacare, which was you know better, but largely based on some of what actually Mitt Romney had done in Massachusetts and Hawaii.
And we looked at what Massachusetts had done. It wasn't just by happenstance.
It was a great irony because Obamacare was in large part based on the plan Mitt Romney had supported, which for political reasons he had to oppose when he ran for president, even though he came up with some of the core ideas.
And that's a little bit of a theme in the book. And look, we see it with your personal experience. And Barack Obama was a state senator, and with policy. If you look at state legislatures, you can really see the future of American politics. And if you look at the present of American politics and talk about state legislatures, you'll find both people and issues have the kind of lineage that we're seeing with a senator. So I would say paid family. So a little hint for those of you who are actually interested in the book. I would believe paid family leave is likely to become a thing the federal government deals with, not because I know anything about what's happening in Washington, not a thing.
It's one of the issues we want to make if we get back the majority, one of our key issues.
I mean, there we go. We could probably do this with a bunch of, I only know that 10 years ago, basically no Americans had it, or 12 years ago. Today, more than 100 million do. So if you just look at states, you kind of have a signal for what's coming. An issue that Senator Schumer worked on at the federal level on protecting on gun safety, expired at the federal level, but has actually been making progress at state level in ways that are very politically popular across the spectrum. And what I sometimes say is any domestic policy issue that you think of, states have done something surprising, have done more harm or good than Congress has in the last 15 years, not for any reason other than in Congress there's one timeline and in states there are 50. So somewhere something's going to break through that's at a greater level.
Just real quick, and then I want to go back to Senator Schumer before he has to go. You've got a very weird situation in the country now because you have about half the country broadly speaking, under the Democrats and half the states under the Republicans, and you're having a kind of pulling apart in terms of public policy, where you have a lot of quite progressive public policy happening in the Democratic-leaning or fully controlled states, and a lot of retreat from progressive policies in Republican states. And again, something you deal with in the book because you make a point that the fact that Democrats had not paid the kind of attention that Republicans did to state government, electing state legislatures. But how does this work now because of this incredible bifurcation in the country?
You really do get two different stories. And I actually wonder if it's reflected in the former state lawmakers who become your colleagues, because you have, the Dobbs decision takes the right to reproductive health care and doesn't wipe it away in the country, just says it's up to the states. And so today, some states have protections much stronger than they did before that decision. And other states, of course, have essentially outlawed reproductive rights. Some have tried to outlaw IVF and other things. And so you do start to get this splitting apart. But I think you see some other things that are interesting. So Texas, not my favorite state in terms of its governance, has a really pretty good electrical grid. They've done some things, and actually California has followed Texas on trying to figure out how to get more housing built and a better electric grid built. So there's some splitting apart, but also some surprising cross-partisan lessons that get taken. But do you see that sort of folks who show up who've been in state government before are even more extreme, or does it tend to bring them back to the middle?
Well, these days probably more extreme in most of the legislative bodies, and that's because they have been organized groups, whether on the far right or far left. And oftentimes, since primaries, even at the state legislative level, are so dominant as to who is chosen, you don't need that many people to influence the primary. So, the MAGA on the hard right, the socialists on the hard left, tend to be more organized, more energetic, and focused. So they'll pick, we're going to win these 7 districts. And they do. So I'd say it's more polarized now because partially because of the low turnout in primaries, and partially because there's much more freedom. New York State has a law where it's very easy to raise money now. You get I forget, what is it, an 8-to-1 match
in the city, right?
In the city, and that means it's very good in the sense that poorer people, and we have a lot of poorer people, are able now to run because they can raise money. But it also allows a very small organized group to have an undue influence, particularly because of the primary system.
By the way, the loyalty that Dan has to his old boss, his staff gave me a list of people who served in, prominent people who served in state legislatures. And the list goes Schumer, Jeffries, Obama, both Roosevelts, and Lincoln. So you put Schumer about 3 presidents ahead of Lincoln, But also,
in order of their influence on me.
Yeah, I think 45% of the Senate, a majority of House members came out of state legislatures. What is your, I just want to press Dan's question, putting aside, so you're arguing it's partly generational, that the younger generation is more on the right in the Republican Party. Yep. What about behavior in terms of colleagues, in terms of, working on bipartisan issues, or having some history of at least on something? In a lot of these states, you had quite conservative legislators who supported something connected to family leave or supported something connected to Medicare because their constituents benefited from it so much. Do you see any effect to that?
Yes, I do. First, people who serve in the state legislatures tend to want to, they've been legislating, and so when they get to Congress, instead of spending a year or two learning or just making speeches for the people back home, they actually want to try to get something done, and they have some skill at doing it, because even, as you say, in some of the more conservative or liberal state legislatures, there's a pattern of getting things done. And I think it tends to be, but not certainly, probably overall, and I check myself on this, the people who have less experience in the legislature are less eager to immediately roll up their sleeves and do bipartisan legislation, and probably more interested in creating a movement, giving speeches, and things like that. So I think it is still, and it's much better. I think it's much better than it used to be, and that's why Daniel's book is so important, because the importance has increased over the years. I think that it's proved to be a very salutary influence.
And does it play a role in your recruiting? Have you noticed any pattern?
Yeah, although, yes, we do. Although many of the people we recruit for the Senate are House members. But we have Sherrod Brown, we have Peltola was in the House, but governors too. Let me think. There aren't many who we recruit from the state legislature to run directly for the Senate, but I'm sure if you went to the House side, that would be the most fertile ground for recruiting.
Right. And Tallarico,
right?
Tallarico is currently
Tallarico is the
This is actually interesting. Way back in 2021, we did a little Zoom with 3 up-and-coming state lawmakers in Texas, just random state lawmakers. Gina Hinojosa is now the Democratic nominee for governor. Jasmine Crockett and James Tallarico, who were all just state lawmakers at the time. Right. Murphy was a former state lawmaker. I think a lot of your colleagues at some time touched the legislature.
I think a lot of them were at one point, but usually there's an intermediate step, either congressman or governor.
Right. You know who's really aware of that intermediate step? All state lawmakers.
Yes.
Focused on it.
So I want to go back to you. Talk about there are a few issues where legislatures have really, mostly in progressive states, but as you say in Texas with their grid, I mean, wind power is quite popular in a lot of red states because there's a lot of space for wind power. Issues where we are living now under better laws because of what the states pioneered that have not been rolled back. Can you talk a bit about some of those successes?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. So we've touched on some of them already. When you talk about paid family leave, you talk about gun safety, you talk about clean energy, grid, energy affordability, minimum wage. So the last time the federal government increased the minimum wage was the same season, the same summer the iPhone came out. It's still 7.25 at the federal level. Today, something like hundreds of billions of dollars have been earned in states that have increased the minimum wage up to $15 or more. That's a pretty dramatic one in terms of people's.
And let me add one. The Congress has been pretty moribund on housing policy, and we have a desperate housing shortage. We look to the legislatures for what they are doing on housing policy, and because so much of it is local and related to zoning and other things, they have really good ideas. I think we're going to do some major housing. We have the Road to Housing Act that's around the edges, but I would predict next year, particularly if we get back the majority, you're going to see some very significant housing legislation, and much of it will come from places like California, like New York, and other places which have sort of been the cutting edge. And it often occurs that the states take over, or their ideas take over, when Congress is just gridlocked, which on certain issues we have been for a long time.
And even landmark legislation from Congress, like the CHIPS and Science Act, which was really a federal bill with federal money and a very forward-thinking folks who aren't familiar with it. It truly landmark. The reason I know that, again, it's not because I follow federal politics so closely, but it was such an important issue in states that were applying for it and that actually need to execute on figuring out how to get that money deployed, spent, and improved in the states. It's a little like Obamacare. Even on landmark federal legislation, and there is some, I do acknowledge, at least when you're in the room, but there really is some, the state is a critical handshake for that to touch people. Even in those cases, there's an intermediate step that comes from who's in power in your legislature.
There's a little bit of reverse in CHIPS and Science, which, I really worked on hard for a long time, is sort of the converse of that. When we tried to design CHIPS and Science, I would not only talk to my colleagues here, but I talked to people in the legislatures about how to make it implementable for them. And a lot of the ideas for CHIPS and Science came from some of the more thoughtful people from the state Senate and from the state Assembly, and it's led to the fact that we've been able in New York to implement a huge amount of new building, new growth, new chips, particularly in upstate New York, which had suffered so when they lost manufacturing 20 years earlier.
So I know you got to go, and he's trying to sell books. So why don't you tell people about bloopers he saved you from in your book, or what that experience was like working with him as
I might have been the cause of more bloopers. I'm physically sometimes pretty awkward. Go ahead.
But talk about that experience.
I can't remember the specifics, but we would sit in my den every Saturday morning, and go over so many things. And he was great. He was a great sounding board. A lot of the ideas are Daniel's. I can't, there are so many bloopers I've made, you can't keep track of them all. But do you remember any?
I mean, there's a lot of great stories in that book. I would say there's a number of stories about being in the legislature. One could almost call it a prequel to the Fourth Branch. I would say that.
Okay, I'll give you my first book people now know it and either are very positive or negative, but we had an imaginary family called the Baileys. And they were a middle-class family, and it was how to win them over to more progressive ideals. That was the idea of the book. And the Baileys really came about from my envisioning a purple, swing, moderate assembly district on Long Island and how people would react in that area. So it really did have an effect on
Absolutely. I would say more the body guide is you're extremely busy and packed schedule always. And one thing I discovered is you're running late. Generally, a human body is a good way to prevent something from starting. So if there's an event, even with the governor, if some 23-year-old body guy refuses to step out from in front of the podium, you can buy yourself a couple of minutes before the state police kind of move you along. So I figured out a number of ways to delay the beginnings of events.
Yeah.
Well, now Senator Schumer, the body guy's making Senator Schumer late, so
Yes,
I think we should thank you for being
But
here.
really, Daniel is just so dedicated to this. And when he started looking at state legislators as an idea to really help progress, no one paid much credence to it. And because of his hard work over how many years? About 12?
9 years.
9 years. It's much more a topic that people pay attention to, even before this book. So he deserves a tremendous amount of credit for taking that fourth branch of government and elevating it so we pay much more attention to it, which will result in better legislation at the state level, but will also result in better legislation at the federal level. So thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much.
So I want you to talk about the States Project and where where did your desire to do it, but also where did the energy start coming from, and what were you pushing against when you started this?
Yeah, so I was in the state Senate for 9 years, and I had this experience that state legislatures were so powerful and no one cared. So I spent 2 years in the majority, and then we went into the minority, which, by the way, is worse, just a piece of insight there from politics. And then we were in the minority because a group of Democrats gave Republicans the majority. And still, our Democratic governor didn't care. And at the same time that was happening, I became aware of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is the most important civic organization most people have never heard of, which is an organization of right-wing state lawmakers that launders legislation nationally. I became aware of it because a Florida teen named Trayvon Martin was murdered, and the person who killed him was not prosecuted because of a stand your ground law in Florida. It turned out that law came from ALEC. So those two facts. So every time I could get this many people in a room, I would say, look, if you want to change the federal government, it's going to be very hard. You're not going to succeed. But if you actually care about the issues you say you do, gather these people in this room for 1 year, take your time, your resources, your expertise, your network, you can make your issue the most important issue in a state within a year. Probably made that speech 50 times. No one took me up on it until Donald Trump was elected. And I was invited to a holiday party on a Saturday night of kid-lit authors. And I didn't think they really...
It's the beginning of the book.
Exactly. I didn't really think they wanted me because would you ever invite your state lawmaker to a social event? Who's done that? Thank you. And it was my youngest son's 3rd birthday. So I said I would put him to bed and then I would go over because I was a state lawmaker and you never say no. And I went over and I made that speech. I was especially irritated about it. And I said this line: with $100,000, you could change power in an entire state. It is cheaper to flip an entire legislature than a single congressional seat. And then I dropped the mic, got ready to zoom out and get home. And two women blocked my way. And a redheaded woman said, we can do it, we can raise $100,000. There was a short-headed woman with her. And I said, yeah. By Inauguration Day, they had done that. And it changed my life. I couldn't believe people were willing to organize themselves for states. I talked to everyone I could possibly talk to about it. I met someone named Adam Pritzker, who's an entrepreneur and was looking to do something in politics. And he said, this is a great idea. I want to help you do it. Let's partner. And the one thing is you've got to leave office. You can't do this from the legislature. This is a project of too much importance. And Adam convinced me to leave office, and we co-founded the States Project. And I thought, you know, if we can be in a couple of states with 10 giving circles, we started calling this group Giving Circles, that would be great. But it grew beyond anything I thought possible, not because state legislatures ever went viral, but because person by person, when people heard the case and thought, you know, I do feel like a spectator to the destruction of my democracy. You know, I'm not going to change who the president is by tweeting at 3 a.m. at someone I don't like, or sending a $7 contribution to a candidate who's going to end their race with $10 million in the bank. And I should do more. I can do more. That case is surprisingly compelling.
We were talking before about how this idea has brought together within, not just within the Democratic Party, but especially within the Democratic Party, a rather broad range of people. 2 nights ago, you were with Mayor Mamdani before the Knicks game. Talk about that and how the exchange you had and why he wanted to do this.
Well, you know, we did call him Senator Schumer while he was here, but it's Assemblymember Schumer and Assemblymember Mamdani. He was in the New York Assembly until, actually this time last year, it's important to say.
Before he's done, he's going to claim every person in the room as a former state legislator, but go on.
There are a few who weren't, but you know, it was a similar conversation in the following way. If you're in public service, whether you're the Democratic leader of the United States Senate, the mayor of New York City, or still a freshman assembly member in a small state, that moment of going out and asking a group of people who are less powerful than you are to hire you, maybe the only job in the world where that's how you get the job, people less powerful than you decide whether to hire you and fire you. And then you show up and your job is service. And I do think for 80 or 90% of public officials, agree with them, disagree with them, once you get those votes, you feel some sense, some obligation to service. That sticks with you. And so for the mayor, as with Senator Schumer, as with other people who we'll be speaking to on this book tour, there's a connection that goes beyond how well known they are to their time in the legislature. That's the first piece. The second piece is, you know, he and I talked about some of the good, the bad, and the bizarre that I had seen in Albany, because those stories are almost unbelievable. I have in the book a former colleague of mine turning to me during a very important meeting. New York State's budget was the third largest budget in the country when I was there, after the federal government, I guess the fourth largest, the federal government, California, and Walmart, then New York State. And he turned to me and said, this is the craziest group of people on earth with any real power. And that's sort of the dynamic in state legislatures. You're anonymous, you have more staff than you used to, as we heard about, but you're understaffed. You're, as my wife used to call me, a local D celebrity in your local supermarket. But you have all of this power. Every issue that's leading cable news every night, every issue that people tear their hair about on social media, you actually are taking up that week or the next week, but just in this sort of relative obscurity. It's quite... it's quite an interesting dynamic to live through.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the opportunity that the legislature gives young Americans to actually exercise power early on in life. I had a great student at Georgetown who walked into my office. He was still a senior. He hadn't graduated yet. And he said, Professor, I just want you to know I'm running for the state Senate. I said, when? And he said, now. And he was going back and forth. He graduated in June and got elected to the state Senate. This was in 2018, that fall. And his name is Will Haskell, and he wrote a book about his experience to encourage other young people to run for office. And it was called 100,000 First Bosses, who who were his bosses as a state senator. Are you seeing take up, and I'm not sure how many young people watch the C-SPAN book show, but, I think that this is, I've thought a lot about Will and his experience, and over time, there are an awful lot of young people who can get a real connection to and real power early on to change things out of the legislature.
I mean, Senator Schumer was elected in his 20s. I was elected in my 20s. Mayor Mamdani was elected in his 20s. Today, there's a guy running for governor in Alaska who left college to get elected, didn't even finish college. He was so young. It is a place where you can do it, but the real reason is because it's possible to change the outcome. I don't think any one of those people was the front runner when they started running for office, and there's legions of stories. I bet Will wasn't either. But in states, politics isn't predetermined the way it often is at a larger level of office, especially in state legislatures. So if you knock on enough doors, and by the way, you ask anyone who ran a competitive race in the state legislature, they'll tell you how many doors they knocked on, 9,867 in 2008. If you knock on enough doors, and you just get enough friends and neighbors to contribute what they can, that changes the outcome. Today, the Speaker in the Alaska Assembly, it's a tripartisan majority, by the way, Democrats, Republicans, Independents. He's an independent. His name is Bryce Edgman. He represents a bunch of islands off the west coast of Alaska, so far that it becomes east again.
What an awesome district.
His first election, it's sort of like my old district, also islands off the coast of the country, Lower Manhattan and part of Brooklyn. I talked about this in the book. His first election, 725 votes to 725 votes. He won because of a literal coin flip. In Virginia in 2017, the entire control of the legislature came down to a tie in a single race. They pulled the name out of a bowl, very Virginia of them, a beautiful old Virginia bowl. The idea that a tiny shift in what happens makes it possible, or that a young person who is willing to roll up their sleeves and do politics can actually end up in politics is possible. And just the last thing I'd say is, like, I think it's become very popular to feel like being in is somehow dirty. We love democracy, but people who are inside it can't be trusted. We love democracy, but we honor those people who protest on the streets rather than figure out how to get into the building. And there's certainly a role for protest and certainly a huge role for government in protecting people's right to do it. But I can't imagine a more idealistic thing for a 21 or 22-year-old to do than go out and put on, buy 5 pairs of sneakers and knock on 10,000 doors and try to actually have some power, not just protest those who do.
My Brookings intern is here tonight, so Carly, this is all for you when you go home. Think about it.
Who are your state lawmakers? Do you know who they are?
What?
Do you know who your state lawmakers are?
Some of them.
Okay, no one else does either.
I want to get people asking questions, including challenging questions, because I still think I've been sympathetic to this idea because I think state government can pioneer a lot of things, both good and bad, and it's important that people understand that. But I identify with that skeptical question about the federal level. So I want to encourage anybody who wants to take that on. Why don't we, if I could take 2 at a time, because I suspect we may get a lot. So, Sir, you go first.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting topic. I'm just learning about the States Project. You talked about flipping state legislatures and this, that. Do you just focus on partisanship, or do you have policies that you're trying to push? What's your focus?
Yeah, so just step back for 1 second. I actually think this question doesn't get asked enough in politics. So at the States Project and in the work I do, we've actually done a lot of work to sort of step back and do, I think, actually what the right wing has been better at, frankly, which is say, what are the core principles? I think Paul Weyrich, who founded the Heritage Foundation and founded ALEC, I talk about this in the book, was very clear on his principles. They're very interesting and might surprise you. Our principles are very clear. We think it is true, self-evident, in fact, that all people are created equal with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government secures those rights with the consent of the governed. That's obviously a familiar concept, but we actually think that's a specific, also, theory of governance. We think it's a theory of governance that requires representative democracy because fundamental equality means you can't choose who has power, the awesome power of the state, any other way. We think it requires effective government. It is an ideology that believes government can be good, can secure rights, and ensure equal opportunity, which takes you to equal opportunity, which is baked into that concept. We think personal freedom is baked in, the idea that you can't organize a society in any unit other than people's individual freedom. And we think the idea that you need an economy or markets that work for everyone who depends on them to participate. So we have a principles basis, and I just call it our founding ideals. In legislatures, though, and I talk about this, there's a myth, and I call it the single savior, the myth of the soul savior myth, which is that a single individual who's really compelling, who's great on social media, can get elected and change everything. Right? Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I have no idea if that was true in the US Senate when that movie was made. That is not true in state legislatures today. You need a coalition. You need a majority if you want to get stuff done. If you're in the minority, you're an observer with an all-access pass. You're like a UN peacekeeper. You have a blue helmet and a weapon with no bullets. And so we do at the States Project think about governing power. So we're very supportive of that multi-partisan majority in Alaska. Democrats, Republicans, Independents. We think they're doing really good things for Alaskans and very focused on their constituents, not special interests. In Nebraska, which is a unicameral legislature that's officially nonpartisan, we've been really focused on trying to make sure they're preserving competitive elections under a lot of pressure from the president to undermine them. And in a lot of places, I'm a lifelong Democrat, we believe that those values are best represented by Democrats being in the majority and having more power. And we can't shy away from that at the States Project because we would be telling a nice story about agreement and peace and love, but we would be undermining our core principles.
By the way, I want to bring in that lady over here. Oh, you've got the next mic, but you after this gentleman. We probably won't get to it, but I do like the horse guy's story in the book. You do talk about the single savior complex and also the lone villain obsession. But before
I mixed them up. I hadn't read that chapter in a little while. Apologies. Yes.
And then before I want you to close with the Connect Four rule of politics, but we'll get to that, sir.
Oh.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I'm curious about your thoughts on state-level ballot referendums, which seem to sort of be maybe the most pure version of the argument that you're talking about. You can make really big change with a really focused effort with not so much money. I think like Alaska ranked choice voting and Washington, D.C. ranked choice voting as examples were referendum initiatives. So just as it relates to your work on states, I was curious to hear your thoughts on, referendums as a way to get big things passed and potentially, bypass the legislature actually by taking it directly to votes in cases it could be popular. And also, I think like in Ohio and maybe other states, we've actually seen some efforts to sort of go against the power of referendums and sort of restrict that ability from people given, what they've been able to accomplish.
Look, big picture, I think referendums, I actually think governors who, considering their power, don't get as much national attention even as they could, other constitutional offices in states, I think every one of these are places that can take what often feels like a doom loop, to use someone else's term, where you don't have any power and give you power. I do think that referenda can sometimes be really quite expensive. As we've seen in a number of high-profile examples recently. And in fact, I'm old enough to remember when, on the progressive side of the aisle, everyone was against referenda because, oh boy, special interests are going to buy them, and then they became more popular. So my view is actually on all state-level policymaking at this moment, we need more public attention on it and more energy. And I actually think with more public attention and more energy, the kinds of principles I described have a supermajority of support in the country. They just don't have enough power. And I would include referenda in that category.
Yeah, referenda are a really interesting question because, and we have gone through cycles, they were originally there put in place in the progressive era so that voters could have a say when state legislators were under the control of lobbyists and big interests, and it was to fight back. And then there was a phase where big interests had so much money that they could finance referenda, they could kill what they didn't want and pass what they wanted. California is a fascinating story on all sides of this question. And now I think they've come back into vogue on the progressive side because certain legislators were legislating against, certain legislatures were legislating against the majority. Usually they were gerrymandered legislatures. So it's a tricky deal. This lady in the middle here.
Thank you. This was a great presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
I have a question it's kind of bold, but I can't wait to ask you. My friend and I were talking in the car on the way in about how spineless the Republicans are, almost to a 1 at the federal level. And it sounds like that's quite different at the state level. And I'm wondering if that's true, and why are Republicans so much more willing to work reasonably with Democrats at the state level that gives us hope that that's where the good action is going to happen?
It's a really thoughtful question. I would actually say, and it's actually exciting because I think sort of thinking about what do we expect on partisanship and how might that be different is one thing I hope people do from the book. I would say that the range is much wider at the state level. So I talk about a colleague well before Trump descended the golden escalator who, supposedly discovered a dead goat in his driveway because of his view that anyone held on with any chance of a terrorist charge should just be tortured, and that all immigrants should be immediately deported. And people thought he had put it there himself. That's pretty Trumpian, in the days before. The interesting thing, and I try to get at this in the book, is we think of a single timeline of partisanship in America, and especially in this town, right? There was the era of bipartisanship. There was the era of sorting. 94, the Gingrich Revolution, everything changed, right? But there's actually 50 timelines of partisanship, 51, and they're all different. I talk about Tony Vargas in Nebraska, a Democrat from Omaha, who was elected into a Democratic superminority in that single chamber in Nebraska, elected into the third leadership position as a Democrat. And I said, how? He said, because people thought I wasn't full of it. It's not what he said, but C-SPAN is here. And that was possible. And he said, but that changed. At some point, what he basically said is Trump noticed us. And so the Republicans had to run to their corner. And then, in fairness, he said, and a group of Democrats reacted by running to their corner. And so no one's willing in the same way. I talk about Rebecca Perkins Quokka in New Hampshire, who's the minority leader, again, a super minority. She's a Democrat. She, by the way, has a couple of kids who she has to take care of.
Super minority, define that.
Super minority. That means that you can't, in a super minority, you can't prevent quorum. You can't stop an override of a governor's veto. You truly have no power. Maybe you got the parking permit, or in New York State, maybe you got the free Saratoga seltzer, but only if they're being nice on the other side.
So it's a negative. I was thinking of a powerful minority.
No, it's... Yeah, it should be called the super stinky, super sucky minority. Yeah. So Rebecca Perkins Quokka passed some great housing legislation with 6 Republicans, including ones in leadership who were crossing their own leader, but because it's New Hampshire and how that works there, they weren't even punished. Whereas in New York, if anyone crosses their party leader, their new office will actually also be their parking spot. And so, I would say that there's more opportunity to think of what's happening in our country differently in states, some of it more ugly. Louisiana, Alabama, we see what they've done after the Supreme Court gutted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Uglier than anything even happening here. And we see these stories of hope. The thing that's different is you can change it. Literally you with the people you know. And in this town, that's essentially not true.
What did you make when President Trump went into Indiana and beat all those state senators. I had the thought when I read your book, maybe he read galleys of your book and realized the power here. And you talk in the book about how when Democrats in particular weren't paying attention to legislatures as the Republicans were, they forgot about the word redistricting. But I'm curious how, sort of talk about that, because I think you've had Washington forces go into states that were bipartisan. And I don't think it's a partisan observation, actually, to say it's particularly on the conservative side, because they understood the threat of that better than I think progressives did. They tried to overturn those examples of bipartisanship.
Yeah, the president actually offered a blurb too long, but we decided not to bring it. I'm a joke. That's a joke. That was, I don't want to be sued. That was a joke. The Indiana case was a really interesting one for a few reasons. One, make no mistake, the president himself has been calling state lawmakers for the last year. He called Texas state lawmakers and asked them to redraw their congressional maps. States draw congressional maps. He called those Indiana lawmakers and took names of those who weren't willing to draw congressional maps from Republican state senators in Indiana. They stood up to him. And then a few days later, he funded a super PAC, or his allies funded a super PAC, to try and punish them, and was able to beat a number of them. Just recently was on the phone, according to reporting, with South Carolina Republican state lawmakers who were not willing to redraw congressional maps. To your question about the differences that are happening in states, he is very attuned to this, and I do think he wants a party that is just loyal to him. I think one possible answer is some state lawmakers haven't been noticed by him yet, and that gives them more freedom.
So I think I'd like you to close before everyone buys your book here to talk about the Connect 4 rule, which I enjoyed when I read about it.
Well, look, the larger project of this book is, as you might be able to tell, I really believe in American democracy. I really believe in the promise of this country going back to 250 years. I think the more we have believed in it, the better we have been. And in fact, we have done incredible things that are unmatched in human history. And I understand why people would have no interest in politics. It feels ugly and far away and like something that you do because you have to. It's the right thing to do to vote. It's the right thing to do, not because you actually might find your own power within it. This book is about trying to give people an understanding that they have more power in our democracy than they realize. They're going to have to learn a few things, a relatively short book's worth, hopefully, not more than that. And hopefully they'll be interesting and the human stories are engaging. But if you learn just a few things, you can walk through this country as a participant in the democracy at a higher level than you realized. And the key to that, I think, is to break this myth. And I've got a couple of political consultant friends in the room, so with apologies to you, this is not three-dimensional chess. That's a myth that is told to make it feel harder to understand what's happening. It's not even chess or checkers. It's Connect 4. Connect 4. You have a simple goal. You want to get 4 in a row, and you don't want to make stupid mistakes. The best people I know in politics are able to distill it that way. Great minds like our former guest who are able to understand more complexity are also able to distill it to what's usable. Connect 4. Set a goal. Think about how you can have the biggest impact by participating. How you can have the biggest impact by participating. Find some friends. And then follow the steps at the end of this book.
I just want to close by reading your inspirational close. I must say the reason I appreciated this most is I think there's so much going on in our public life that's demobilizing people, driving people away from public life, and I think particularly young people. And this is an invitation that you people can have power. And so I'll just read these words. Whichever you choose, when you take these activities on, you won't be a spectator anymore. You'll understand how political power is wielded. More important, you'll be the one wielding it, and our democracy will be stronger because of you. Thank you for the book. Thank you to our C-SPAN audience, and thanks for coming.
Thank you so much, everyone.